This is Larry Jordan. My presentations at BVE 2014 were sponsored by Blackmagic Design and Pond 5. We've had a chance to see some beautiful 4K images in this theater and all around the trade show, but now we have to decide whether we want to spend our own money to shoot 4K, edit 4K, distribute 4K, and my whole reason for being here is to give you some questions to think about as you decide whether 4K is in your future or not, because there's a whole lot more decisions to be made than simply, I need to buy a 4K camera. And that's what this morning and this afternoon's presentation is going to cover. I spoke at BVE last year about 4K, and at that time I said, you know, it's a really interesting concept, just like the concept of 3D, which we know has taken off like a rocket in the independent film industry. And all of us have 3D television sets in our home, so we need to mirror that success with high resolution like 4K. So let me give you what I decided were our going forward steps from last year. 4K may be the future, but it has steep technical requirements. If higher resolution is your goal, shooting higher frame rates last year made more sense than shooting 4K, and it costs less money. If flexibility in editing is your goal, then you want to pick a 4K format with little to no compression to minimize artifacts. And if higher quality distribution is your goal, we need to look at distributing 4K images on a Blu-ray disc. If future-proofing was your goal, then you want to shoot 2K at a higher frame rate, which can easily be up-res to 4K. That's what we decided last year. But our industry does not stand still, and I decided to revisit this subject this year. While the jury is still out on distribution, theaters like this notwithstanding, 4K is only really relevant for theatrical distribution. The benefits of shooting and editing 4K are finally sufficient for us to actually consider investing the time and money in improving our facilities. But before we rush out and buy the latest 4K camera and start to shoot 4K, not all 4K is the same, not all 4K cameras are the same, and we need to consider our goals, our system, and our workflow before we shoot or edit 4K. We need to ask ourselves, why are we shooting 4K? Are we simply future-proofing our media? Now, I hate to break this to you, but there were films made in, the 1930s and 1940s, which are still generating revenue to this day, which don't have 4K resolution. I know it seems shocking, but can you believe that somebody could actually make a profit on images that are less than 4,000 pixels at a side? Maybe, just maybe, the story may have an influence on what people are actually paying money to see, not simply spending money to get extra pixels on the screen. Or are you shooting 4K because your cameraman is just congenitally unable to frame a shot? And you want to shoot extra pixels to drop it into your editing system so you can reframe the shot because you're going to actually edit a 2K image and drop a 4K image, which allows you to zoom in when they should have but didn't. Or to image stabilize because they were hand-holding the camera and they had perhaps partied too much the night before. Or maybe distribution requires it, and you have to shoot 4K to meet the needs of distribution. Or, and this is my favorite one, you can sell it to the client and they will pay extra for it, and frankly, I don't care. If I can get money for this, I'm shooting whatever the client wants. Our job is to run a business. Our job is not to beta test cameras. Our job is not to beta test software. Our job is to convert clients into cash so we can pay the bills and pay the rent and keep moving forward. The vendor's job is to convince us to buy. Our job is to figure out how we're going to fit it into the workflow that we're working with. The decision to shoot, edit, distribute 4K images impacts everything that we do. And anybody that says it doesn't has already gone through the pain and forgotten how awkward that transition was. Does anybody remember the transition from standard def to high def, from 4:3 to 16:9? We had to rethink everything. I mean, we're moving files around, that part is true, but the systems that we needed to use to move those files from point 1 to point 2 have totally changed, and they change again as we move to higher resolutions. This is important. I want to show you on a pixel perfect, one-for-one basis, a full Ultra HD image. There it is. Is that not glorious? Look at the incredible detail inside that picture. It brings tears to my eyes just looking at it on the screen. Except, this is the actual 4K picture. I'm running this on a 1280 by 720 screen, and all I can fit on that screen is that much of the image. In fact, the white box indicates that part of a 4K image that I can show pixel accurately on this screen. So why did I shoot 4K in the first place? You can't see it! Sorry, I get a little overwrought. Let's continue. The original image is what's called Ultra HD. It's 3840 pixels across by 2160 pixels high. In this particular theater, the screen is projected at a 4K, actually it's a 1080 image, so we're looking at something smaller than 2K on the screen, and this exact slide projection was created at 1280 720. So in order for me to fit this image on this screen, I needed to take a 4K image and scale it 67%, so we're only seeing 1 in 3 pixels that were shot. I mention this solely because what you see and what you shot are not necessarily the same thing. Why did we use this extra resolution? Now, there may be reasons for using it, but never take for granted that because you're sitting in a theater that's got 4K on the door, you're seeing 4K on the screen. Now, I hate suspense, so I'm going to give you the conclusion first, and then we'll back into it. We're in what I call a 3-codec world. We shoot one format, which is camera native, H.264, RAW, AVC HD, AVC Cam, AVC Intra, ProRes, ProRes HQ, whatever the codec happens to be that your camera supports. Then we edit a second codec called an intermediate codec. This moves into our editing system, either a proxy file or a ProRes transcoded file. Then we distribute a third codec. We're sending it to the web at H.264. We're sending it to broadcast at MXF. We're sending it as a DPX file or cinema DNG file. Whatever it is, we've got 3 separate entities. One to shoot, one to edit, one to output. Now, if you think back to the days of standard def, it was easy. We grab a digibeta camera or a digibeta, depending upon where in the world you're located. You grab a digibeta camera, you shoot digibeta, you edit digibeta, you broadcast digibeta, you deliver it on a tape. Everything works great. There's no harm, no foul. Lord, I wish stuff was that easy today, but it is not. Now we've got to deal with all the different file formats. We've got to deal with all the different codecs. We have to deal with all the image sizes. 4K acquisition is increasingly easy, with software and camera support growing on a daily basis. However, a strong case has yet to be made for editing or distributing 4K images except for theatrical release. Let's take a look first at production. 4K cameras are increasingly available from the GoPro Hero 3, which is a US $395 camera. Blackmagic Designs Cinema Camera 4K, JVC, Canon, Panasonic just announced a new Lumix GH4, Sony, Red, Vision Research 4A. I can go from a $300 GoPro to a $130,000 4A camera. Every single one of those shoots a 4K image. But it's not the same 4K image. It may be 4,000 pixels across, but how those pixels get processed changes on a camera by camera and codec by codec basis. In fact, we can't even agree on what a 4K image size is. There's 2 different image sizes, one called Ultra HD and the other called Cinema 4K. Ultra HD takes a 1080 image, 1920, and doubles it to 3840. 1080 doubles it to 2160. An Ultra HD image is the best possible option for all of us that have created 1080p material because all we have to do is double the pixel size. It upreses very easily, very quickly, and gives us a good-looking image. But the engineers don't like it because actually what it needs to be is a power of 2. And 2 to the 8th power is 1,024 pixels across. So a 4K image actually needs to be 2 to the 32nd power, which is 4,096 pixels across, or something like that, by 2160 high. So we've got Cinema 4K, which is a true 4,000 pixel picture, and Ultra HD, which is a 3840 picture. I mention this only in passing because 4K is actually just like HD, two different image sizes which have two different resolutions. If we take a look at the actual screen size, this is what we all grew up watching. Seems hardly worth it, doesn't it? Seems like we should never even turn the TV on, because why would you watch a picture that's the size of a postage stamp? The fact that it would make you feel good and make you laugh or make you cry is irrelevant. The resolution's too small. No one really watches pictures that are that small anymore. Then we've got a 1080p image. Blackmagic Design cinema camera is a 2.5K image, which is 2400 pixels by 1350. Ultra HD, and then Cinema 4K and 5K red. And then because people like driving us completely nuts, we have a 6K image to work with, and we've got an 8K image to work with. Image resolutions are now becoming so great that we're not moving the camera, we're moving a region of interest inside the frame. So cameras no longer pan, we're doing pan and scan moves inside the image itself. The benefits to all these extra pixels in terms of reframing or image stabilization are obvious. If I've got a really, really big picture, I can zoom in to see just a part of it. Or if I have to stabilize an image, I can stabilize an image without zooming in and creating fat pixels and causing the image to go soft. However, just because the pixels are there doesn't mean that the audience can see them. We proved that just recently when we were looking at that image earlier in this presentation. Here's another interesting test. John Galt, who's the Senior Vice President for Technology at Panavision, said at a 2012 Creative Cow conference that we perceive edge sharpness as focus. If the edges are sharp, we can clearly see a delineation. We consider the image to be in focus. If the edge blurs from one portion of that shape to another, we consider it to be soft. So soft, blurry edges means that we don't see resolution. The way that we view a screen is 1.5 to 2 times the height of the screen. So this looks like, for me, it's about a 10-foot screen, which means the people in row 4, row 5 are at the optimum distance to see the absolute maximum resolution on that screen. That's presuming that it's a 2K picture. As the resolution increases, we have to move closer to be able to perceive the edge difference. And that means that in order to see the actual sharpness of a 4K image, everybody in every row except the front row has to leave, because you're not able to perceive, our eyes can't see the resolution of a 4K image at more than about 6 feet away from the screen. If we want greater resolution, John's research at Panavision showed that we don't want to increase the number of pixels on the screen. We need to make sure that we've got clear edge sharpness, which means we want to shoot at a higher frame rate. There's also an issue of color. You may have heard of a term called the Bayer pattern. This is a Bayer pattern. And if you look at it very closely, you'll see that there's twice as many green pixels as there are red or blue. The process of de-Bayering is inventing extra red pixels and inventing extra blue pixels, inventing data which was not captured by the camera, so that we have the exact same number of red, green, and blue elements for each pixel. So when we de-Bayer an image, we're actually manufacturing 2/3 of that frame that wasn't captured by the camera. The black and white image is captured by the green, but the color image is captured by doubling the number of red and blue pixels. This simply means that we're not even when I shoot 4K, I'm not really shooting 4K in color, I'm shooting 4K in green and 2K in red and blue. There's 2 ways that we can output from a camera. I'll just mention this so when you look at a camera, you understand what the differences are. There's an HDMI output, and there's a HD SDI output. HDMI is high-definition multimedia interface, and what that allows us to do is it feeds video out, audio out, but no time code. HDMI does not carry a time code signal, and the connectors themselves are fragile, which means that HDMI is really good for short cable runs which don't involve cross-connecting cables and don't involve switching. HDSDI is a more robust format, connects via cable which locks with a BNC connector. High-definition serial digital interface carries audio, video, and time code. And it's a more ideal solution when you need to travel long distance or you need to switch the signal through a router. So now that we've got a sense that there's a wide variety of cameras, there's a wide variety of methods we can use to obtain a 4K image, now the real hard work begins. We've now shot the picture. We need to edit. Here's the challenge that we've got. It's the codec. A codec is a piece of mathematics that converts reality into numbers that can be stored in a computer. TIFFs and JPEGs are codecs for still images. AVC HD, H.264, ProRes are codecs for video. AIF, WAVE, MP3s are codecs for audio. In all these cases, it's a piece of mathematics that lives between real life, what our eyes and ears see and hear, and what the ones and zeros are that are stored inside the computer. This conversion process is accurate or inaccurate only so far as the codec itself is able to accurately represent reality. The determining factor of whether a codec can represent reality accurately is the bit rate. This determines the number of individual ones and zeros that can be processed per second. Some codecs have a very, very low bit rate. AVC HD is a classic example. Delivers about 3 megabytes a second. Other codecs, like ProRes, have a high bit rate and a higher image quality, delivering about 18 to 20 megabytes per second. Bit rate determines file size. The faster the bit rate, the larger the file. Bit rate determines quality, and the codec is the interpreter between reality and the computer. Well, the reason this is important is that the file sizes that we work with in a 4K file are enormous. Let's just do the math. Let's take a Cinema 4K image. It's 4096 by 2160. That means that when we multiply those two numbers together, each individual 4K frame contains just a little bit less than 9 million pixels. It's a 9 megapixel frame. If we shoot at a frame rate of 30 frames a second, and I could have picked 60, I could have picked 24, I picked one in the middle, that means that we have 4 billion pixels that we have to process per second. Each pixel has information, red, green, blue, and alpha channel, associated with it, which by the time we do the math means that an uncompressed 4K, Cinema 4K image per second requires 500 megabytes per second uncompressed. I've got to compress it, have to compress it. The file sizes are too big. If you are doing a dissolve in real time between shot 1 and shot 2 of uncompressed 4K images, that's 500 times 2, or slightly more than 1 gigabyte per second for the duration that dissolve exists. Now let's put this in perspective. If we take a look at a single hard drive, one hard drive, and assuming that it's seamlessly connected into a computer, that hard drive sends data back and forth at about 120 megabytes a second. 120 megabytes a second for a hard drive. That means that even if I wanted to, I cannot play a 4K image on a single hard drive. If I combine more than one hard drive together, which forms a RAID, I can combine the speed of multiple hard drives. In order to be able to play back an uncompressed 4K image, I have to have a RAID that consists of at least 6 hard drives. Well, if you don't even have this kind of equipment, if you're somebody that's running around with a single hard drive because you're editing standard def or a 2-drive RAID, it's not sufficient to even play back uncompressed 4K. And if our job is to compress 4K, this is like, I'm going to shoot the most glorious picture I can and save it as a JPEG. A JPEG is a lossy picture format. I'm going to throw away all this image data. I would rather shoot a smaller image uncompressed than a bigger image as JPEG because I'm not capturing the pixels that are there. The codec itself throws them away. We record on a variety of capture media, whether it's CF cartridge or SSD. I mean, you see the list here, external hard drives and flash drives. However, not all of these capture devices can record at a high rate of speed. For instance, on DSLR cameras, like the Canon 5D, if I have a Canon 5D, it plugs into an SDHC card. and it records a format called AVC HD or H.264, and it records that format at slightly more than 3 megabytes a second. 3 megabytes a second. The reason the data rate is so low is that the bandwidth going into that card only supports 3.2 megabytes a second. That's the fastest the card can record. Which means that if I want to record video on that SD card, I have to figure out some way of compressing so much of the data that it only goes down to 3 megabytes a second. Well, I started with 500 megabytes a second. I've got to throw away 99% of the information the camera captured at the moment I record it to the card because the card doesn't go fast enough? Help me connect the dots here. I'm shooting high resolution to throw 99% of it away? This doesn't make any sense. An understanding of the speed with which your devices record, an understanding of which codec is being used, an understanding of what's being thrown away is essential. Otherwise, you think, hey, I'm shooting this 4K image, it's going to be glorious, except 98.771% has just disappeared before it got recorded to the card. Why would we do something this foolish? Because we don't know the questions to ask. Even if you plan to shoot 4K so you can edit 2K, say for reframing or for image stabilization, you have all the data and storage requirements of 4K. Scaling a 4K image, I've got 4K source media, but I'm going to drop it into my timeline as a 720p image. Scaling, I still have all source media stored on my hard drive. Scaling does not generate new media, but my render files will be smaller and my output files will be smaller, but I still have source media to manage. But scaling does not reduce the bandwidth necessary to bring the data in from the hard disk. I need to have a data pipe that connects my storage to my computer that goes at least 20% faster than 500 megabytes a second. I got to have a data pipe that moves data at least 750 megabytes a second. Then we look at proxy files. If we create proxy files, we still have all the storage needs of our source media. We add the storage of our proxy files, but our bandwidth decreases. Maybe proxy files make sense. Maybe proxy files don't because you don't have the time. Some codecs, H.264, MPEG-2 MXF, and XDCAM 422, are extremely compressed. You're going to be throwing away 50, 60, 70% of your data that you capture on a 4K image. If you're throwing that much data away, there's no reason to shoot 4K because you're going to end up with artifacts in your images. Less compressed, but not necessarily uncompressed, are 10-bit log RAW, Sony's SR 12-bit, 12 and 16-bit red code RAW. By the way, red code is compressed between 18:1 and 3:1. We've also got 14-bit linear RAW and a 16-bit linear RAW. The higher the bit rate, the more accurate the picture. The lower the bit rate, the more we're compressing the file. 16-bit linear RAW would be pretty darn close to uncompressed. Even the data rates that the cameras create vary. A GoPro, by the way, a GoPro shooting 4K image only goes 15 frames a second. If you're shooting death-defying stunts of somebody jumping off a cliff, then 15 frames a second is fine. But if you're trying to do any kind of dance movements where you need to see smooth movement across the frame, 15 frames a second is going to seem jerky. But the benefit is it gives me a data rate of 5.6 megabytes a second. Sony's JVC's 18 megabytes a second, Red RAW's up to 42, uncompressed up to 500 megabytes. The only way you're able to reduce the data rate is by throwing image data away. There's no magic here. We're not saving stuff up for later. The way that data rates get smaller is we toss out image data. So the question now becomes, how much image data can you afford to lose? If you're doing an action adventure, the GoPro's perfect. If you're doing green screen, then you've lost way too much color detail. You're not going to be able to get a clean key. If you're doing rotoscoping, where you need to be able to see edge detail around hair, you're not going to see it at a low data rate. So you want to do CGI work, it has to be a high data rate. You want to do action adventure sports with stuff that's badly lit, handheld camera shot by amateurs, nobody's going to notice 4K in the first place. Shoot 2K, make your life easier. Also, the hard disk rate plays a factor. Remember I said earlier that a hard disk goes at 120 megabytes a second. Back in the old days, 2 years ago, we would attach that hard disk via USB 2. We transfer data 10 to 15 megabytes a second. That's the limit of the protocol. We attach that same hard disk via FireWire 400, goes about 25 megabytes a second. That's the limit of the protocol. If we attach it via FireWire 800, it goes about 85 megabytes a second. The hard disk in all three of those cases is faster than the protocol. Now we change that. We go to USB 3. USB 3 is a big pipe, but I'm filling that pipe with a garden hose. USB can go as fast as 460 megabytes a second. But the garden hose, that hard disk, only goes 120 megabytes a second. So as much as I want USB 3 to go 460, if I only have one hard drive, the fastest that pipe is going to get filled is 120 megabytes a second. Now it's not the protocol that gates, it is the hard disk. Thunderbolt, 1.1 gigabytes a second. Fiber channel, 1.6 gig. Thunderbolt 2, 2.2 gig. Massively large pipes. And if all you've got plugged into it is a single hard drive, that massively large Thunderbolt 2 pipe is going at exactly 120 megabytes a second. The speed of the hard disk determines how fast that pipe gets filled. But the marketing people don't want you to know this. The marketing people don't say, oh, this hard disk only goes 120 megabytes a second. Everybody would go, piffle, I don't want to buy it. Piffle is an American term. Anyway, what they say instead is on the box, this incredible hard disk supports Thunderbolt 2, which goes up to 2.2 gigabytes a second, which is an absolutely true statement that leads to the false assumption that because the protocol supports 2.2 gigs a second, the hard disk supports 2.2 gigs a second. There is no relationship between the two. The hard disk goes 120 megabytes a second, regardless of how you connect it. So, first thing you got to look at is how am I connecting all of my peripherals? How am I wiring my editing suite? If I've got everything connected FireWire 800, 4K is not for you. You aren't anywhere close to fast enough. All I have are 2-drive RAID zeros, nowhere close to fast enough, half the speed that you need. Oh, but what I'll do is I'll compress it. I'll edit everything camera native. It's shot AVC HD, and you've just tossed 90% of your image away? Why are you shooting 4K? Because the client wants 4K. Great. Take the money, just don't tell them the truth. The truth is they're paying for quality they aren't getting. By the way, I want to digress on hardware for just a minute. Apple released the new Mac Pro the last part of December. I had the great pleasure of working with one for about 30 days, and I'm saving up my pennies to buy one for myself. But one of the questions I get asked a lot is, I want to buy a new Mac Pro, where do I spend the money? Any currently shipping Macintosh, even the Mac Mini, can edit a 4K image. Any shipping Macintosh today can edit a 4K image. It's going to take a while to render, but it can edit. You do cuts only, 4K, piece of cake. The CPU is no longer the bottleneck. So many of us get focused on, oh my goodness, I need to get a 2.5, not a 2.4 gigahertz microprocessor because that extra 0.1 gigahertz of microprocessing power is going to make all the difference in how I edit. This is wrong! CPU speed is irrelevant. GPU speed is everything. If you're going to spend money, spend your money on getting the fastest GPU you can afford. If you're going to buy a Mac Pro, don't stop in the middle. Go all the way up to the top. Get the dual G700s with as much VRAM as you can afford, because what we've discovered is that CPU speed is pretty well topping out around 3 gigahertz a second. The GPU has not yet begun to be tapped in terms of what we can do for performance of GPUs, and the dual GPUs inside the Mac Pro are breathtaking in what they can accomplish, and we have not even seen a fraction of the speed that they can create. So when you're spending your money first, buy the GPU. That's the first. Adobe has not yet optimized most of their software for the dual GPUs. They support it, but it's not optimized. Apple has begun the optimization in terms of Final Cut, but not in terms of compressor. And those are the leading edge programs. The rest of the development community is scrambling to get stuff optimized. The speed differences we're going to see in Mac Pro based software by the end of this year are going to leave you stunned, because we're finally going to have the horsepower inside the computer to take advantage of it. So spend your money first on the graphics card. Second, buy RAM. If you're able to, buy 16 gig of RAM for any editing product that you're doing, whether it's Final Cut or whether it's Adobe. I don't know Avid, so I can't speak to that. Both of them will use RAM. For small projects, 5, 10, 15 minutes or less, 16 gig is fine. As you move into longer feature film, animation type projects, get as much RAM as you can put in the computer. Apple and Adobe both will use every piece of RAM that's inside the Mac Pro. First priority, graphics card. Second priority, RAM. Third priority, buy faster storage. Now, the way it generally worked is we would obsess to make sure we got exactly the right computer, and we would spend about 7 months researching computers, and we'd buy the computer, and then when we need to get storage, we go to the store, we see, 4 terabytes for $400, 4 terabytes for $300, I buy the cheap 4 terabyte. You're going to spend more money for storage, and your performance is gated by your storage. It's not gated by your CPU. If you're going to spend time sweating rivets, sweat rivets over getting the best possible storage. Don't sweat rivets over getting the CPU. An iMac is perfectly okay for editing 4K video. An old Mac Pro, perfectly okay for 4K video. A new Mac Pro, blindingly fast in editing 4K video, and nobody cares because the speed of your system is going to be determined by your storage, not by the computer you're editing it on. You don't need the top-of-the-line 12-core CPU, because even if you had it, nobody could tell by looking at it because the outside of the Mac Pro looks the same. Get a 6-core unit if you need to save money. Get an 8-core unit. For me, the 8-core is the sweet spot. And tell everybody it's a 12-core. How are they going to know? By looking at it. If you take the cover off, the CPU is on the inside of the chimney. You can't see how many cores there are. Spend money on the graphics card, spend money on RAM, spend money on storage. We can use an iMac. However, not all codecs will edit well on an iMac because of the horsepower involved. Red files, R3D files, are perfectly okay on an iMac, but a Canon 1DC file is going to be pretty mathematically intense and probably not. If your principal goal is single stream, an iMac is fine. If your goal is multi-camera work, you're going to need the horsepower of a Mac Pro. Spend your money on fast storage. I cannot stress that enough. And there's no reason to get a 4-drive RAID if you're planning to do high resolution. A 4-drive RAID is not fast enough. You want to get an 8-drive RAID, or at minimum a 6-drive RAID. And max out RAM. Apple's RAM is very expensive. Third-party RAM is just as good. Get third-party RAM. Now let's take a look at output. Phil Holland, who's the DP and visual effects supervisor for Iron Man and X-Man, always outputs his projects in 4 flavors. A DPX, which is the video master, a WAV file, which is uncompressed audio for the audio master, a .mov, which is uncompressed QuickTime. It's actually compressed QuickTime, and it's a ProRes file, which makes it easy to review because QuickTimes are easier to review than DPX files, and a .mp4, which is an H.264 client review copy, so you've got something relatively small that can be shuttled around. Keep in mind that a 4K DPX frame is 50 megabytes in size. An hour of DPX output's about 180 gigabytes. But the benefit to DPX, because each DPX frame is a single file, is that if one of those frames gets blown, you just simply replace the frame. The DPX files are fine. If you lose a frame in a QuickTime movie, the entire QuickTime movie breaks. This is the one that we don't have solved. Archiving. How do you plan to store these massive files for the long term? And I don't define long term to be 500 years or even 100 years. I'm hoping for 25 years. That's the best we can hope for at this point. The best long-term archiving solution we have available to us today is LTO tape, linear tape open. The current model is LTO6. LTO5 is also sold. This is a tape-based format similar to the cartridges that we looked at when we were shooting Digibeta. LTO hardware, however, is not inexpensive. Now, if you're a studio and you've got millions of dollars to spend, then this is not a problem. A $10,000 to $20,000 archiving solution can be easily obtained. But I'm not a studio. I'm a standalone independent producer. How do I archive my stuff? With very, very few exceptions, LTO is a $6,000 to $10,000 solution at the low end. It is my hope that what we're going to see at NAB in April this year will be at least two, I know of one, but I'm expecting two announcements of low-end LTO archiving. What you need to know about LTO, however, is that there's a generation. Each generation of LTO, LTO4, LTO5, LTO6, lasts for 18 months. Then the next version, LTO7, LTO8, comes out. The way the LTO spec is written is LTO6 will read and write LTO6 tapes, read and write LTO5 tapes, but read only LTO4. This means that although the actual life of the tape is 25 years, I need to upgrade my LTO gear every 3 generations to move it to the new format, because if I wait too long, there's going to be no way to play that tape back because of the way the LTO format is archived. So although we have the best options for archiving with LTO, we're automatically committing ourselves to every 5 years buying a new LTO device and then hiring a production assistant to copy all those tapes from the old generation to the new generation. So it really becomes maintenance over time. It's not just something a box like a film product. You can put 35mm film on the shelf and let it sit. With LTO, we're going to have to remember when it was created, what version of LTO created it, and make sure that we can update it as the generations evolve. This gets me to the most murky question. How are we going to distribute our 4K files? Shooting 4K is easy. Editing 4K is not hard. It just requires a rethinking of how we go about getting our equipment, hooking our gear together, and making sure that we got fast enough storage. But are we going to play these files theatrically like we are here, or broadcast, or cable, Blu-ray disc, or the web? While Sony has equipped most of its owned theaters to 4K projection, most of the rest of the digital theaters that are out there are only 2K. Which means that I'm going to be shooting and editing a format which I cannot project theatrically. However, theatrical projection does give us the best way of viewing a high-resolution image, with the exception of iMacs. iMacs absolutely will want a really, really beautiful 4K image, and that's going to have to be uncompressed 4K from acquisition through editing to final distribution. It's interesting to me that 6 weeks ago, only last month, Paramount, one of the big 6 studios in Hollywood, Paramount announced that for the first time ever in its history, it's going to all digital distribution. The rest of the Hollywood studios are taking your digital files and creating a film print and sending that film print out to the world. And we all know what happens to film as it goes to the projector more than 5 or 6 times. It gets dusty, it gets scratched, sprockets get torn, we get edge jitter, and all of a sudden this beautiful 4K image, if we're lucky, looks as good as 1080p. Broadcast television. While the UHD TV, the Ultra High Definition TV standard, was approved by the ITU in 2012, implementation and rollout across all broadcasters is slow because of high capital costs. This is not a good time to be a broadcaster. Audiences are disappearing, revenues are drying up, and finding the ability to do a major investment in capital plant, especially for multiple stations, is not a trivial process. They just finished upgrading to HD. There's not a whole lot of incentive to upgrading to 4K for broadcast because there's no 4K sets in a home. There's no 4K sets in a home because the sets are $20,000 a piece. And the people that can afford a $20,000 4K television, knowing that there's no content out there, are pretty slim. It's a classic chicken and the egg problem. Even when they convert to 4K, we're going to have some significant image compression. And the differences between a 1080p image and a 2K image are not sufficient to require rewiring a broadcast plant. I think this is going to take us a while. Cable head ends are designed for 1080 interlaced images, and I won't even begin to tell you the problem that interlacing causes. We all know it. While replacing the head end is relatively doable, cable now needs to go back in and replace the last mile connection because the last mile connection isn't fast enough to support a 4K distribution. And that is a massive amount of work. Higher frame rates are easier to support than larger image sizes. There is a potential solution, which is a new codec that was approved by the ITU in January of 2013, called HEVC, or the H.265 codec. When we compress files with H.265 compared to H.264, we get about a 30 to 35% reduction in file size. However, this particular codec is designed to solve bandwidth limitations within the cellular network, because all of us are watching YouTube videos on our cell phones, and the wireless carriers are going completely nuts with data overload, so they invented this codec to solve that. It's only tangentially of interest to us in terms of broadcast or cable. This brings up Blu-ray. I skipped Blu-ray completely, and you understand why. If Blu-ray was making any less noise in the market, it'd be a black hole sucking things in. It has not proven to be a great success in the broad marketplace. It's only available really for the studios, which rules most of us out. Which brings us to the web, and normally right now the web is a 720p distribution format. This is bandwidth constricted. We've got bandwidth limitations all over the world. Australia may be running at 55 gajillion megawatts downloading, and half the United States is lucky if they can get 2 megabits downloading. The problem is you got to take lowest common denominator if you want people to watch your files, and right now that's a 720p world, and while YouTube is able to take 4K images, the problem is that very few people can play them. Just to give you an example, a 15-inch Retina MacBook Pro, top of the line, shipping today from Apple, has a screen resolution of half 4K. Even if I had the best possible laptop, the highest possible resolution, I can't look at a 4K image. I can only see a 2K image. An Apple Thunderbolt display is smaller than that, and a Retina display iPad is smaller than that. For the web, 2K is more than sufficient. About a week after I gave this presentation at BVE, I spoke with Michael Cioni, the CEO of Lightiron, talking about 4K distribution. And he gave me an entirely different perspective on 4K. Now, prior to talking to Michael, I was pretty dubious that we would actually be able to distribute high-resolution images through any currently available technology. But then Michael said this, and I quote, "If you really want to get 4K content into your environment, the theaters are actually the worst set. Amazon, Hulu, Netflix, Google, Microsoft, Apple, those are the groups that have the incentive and the exhibition platform with which to create 4K exhibition that is far more reachable and superior to that which is required in the theatrical realm. In other words, 4K distribution can bypass traditional channels and connect directly to consumers via the internet." Michael continued, "If all the exhibitors come together with all the right technology, yet the creative people aren't creating 4K content, it doesn't really matter how many outputs are out there. We have to build 4K content before we actually have the justification to exhibit it." Michael, in other words, was putting down a challenge to producers to say, guys, we have the technology, the internet allows the distribution, but first we have to create the content. This alone forced me to rethink that maybe there is an opportunity for distributing 4K content via the web. We're in a 3-codec world. We're going to shoot one codec, we're going to edit a second codec, we're going to distribute a third codec. The life of transcoding is going to be with us for a long time to come. You want to acquire images at the highest quality that makes sense for your project. However, that does not necessarily mean all 4K is the same. Reframing in post is a great advantage because we can solve problems of coverage. Future-proofing by having all of your master files at 4K makes sense, but shooting 4K images that are highly compressed, think MPEG-4, does not yield as good a quality as 2K images that are uncompressed, or shooting 2K at a higher frame rate is also going to look better than a highly compressed 4K image. The advantages of editing 4K in post, however, are less clear. Storage increases exponentially, 9 times the size of 720p, 4 times the size of 1080p. And the speed of our computer is far less than the speed of our storage. We can use proxy files, of course, but that increases our storage requirements. And shooting 4K to edit 2K or shooting 4K to edit 1080p makes sense, but you're shooting and throwing away pixels, and especially if you plan to go to the web, 4K is a format that makes no sense whatsoever. For me, the gating factor is distribution. As always, our industry changes quickly. There's nothing wrong with experimenting with higher resolutions. Just keep in mind that selecting the right camera is just the start of the decisions you're going to have to make and just the start of the impact it's going to have on your editing plant. Shooting and editing 4K demands that you consider your entire workflow, not just your camera or your video format. My name is Larry Jordan. Thank you very much.